I'm Melissa, 28, a software developer who recently moved back to my hometown after being laid off from my tech startup. At our annual family Easter dinner at my grandparents' suburban home, my brother Jake was doing what he does best, bragging about his successful tech career to our extended family. Then came the moment that changed everything. "Not everyone can handle a real career in tech," he said, looking directly at me with that smug smile. My grandmother Eleanor, 78, set down her fork and gave him a look I'd never seen before. If you've ever had a family member try to diminish your accomplishments, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe for more family drama revelations, because what my grandma did next left everyone at that dinner table speechless. To understand why Jake's comment hit so hard, you need to know our history. Growing up in Cedar Falls, Iowa wasn't exactly Silicon Valley. While other kids played sports or joined debate teams, I was the 12-year-old taking apart computers and putting them back together in our basement. My parents thought it was just a phase. They didn't see technology as a viable career path in our small Midwestern town where manufacturing and agriculture dominated. Jake is 3 years older than me, and from day one, he was the golden child. He followed our father's practical path: business degree, corporate job, clear progression ladder. Our parents never explicitly said they favored him, but it showed in subtle ways: the proud refrigerator displays of his conventional achievements, the excited phone calls to relatives when he got promotions, the way they introduced him at community events. "This is our son Jake. He's in business development at Transtech," they'd theme. Then, almost as an afterthought, "And this is Melissa. She does computer things." The only person who truly saw me was Grandma Eleanor. She lived just 2 streets over, and I spent countless afternoons at her house growing up. And like my parents, she never dismissed my interests as frivolous. When I taught myself basic HTML at 13 and showed her my first clunky website, she clapped her hands together and called me brilliant, a word I rarely heard at home. "Never let anyone tell you what you can and cannot learn," she'd tell me while baking her famous snickerdoodles. "The human mind is limitless." She taught me perseverance when debugging seemed impossible, patience when my projects failed, and pride in creating something from nothing. What I didn't know then was why she connected so deeply with my technological pursuits. Throughout high school, I battled constant imposter syndrome. Despite consistently earning top marks in math and science, I questioned whether I belonged in tech. This wasn't helped by Jake's habit of minimizing my achievements. When I won the regional science fair with a rudimentary AI program that could predict weather patterns, Jake called it cute and asked if it could make him a sandwich. When I received a partial scholarship to study computer science at State University, he wondered aloud if they had lowered the requirements this year. Each dismissal was delivered with a laugh and a shoulder punch. So if I reacted, I was just being too sensitive. My parents weren't malicious, just worried. "We just want you to have stability, honey," my mom would say. "The tech industry is so volatile. Jake's company has great benefits and a pension plan." After graduating with honors, I landed a job at BuildButter, a promising startup developing accessibility software. For 3 years, I thrived, leading a team developing tools to make websites accessible for visually impaired users. Then came the economic downturn. Funding dried up, and half the company was laid off, including me. At 28, I found myself temporarily moving back to my childhood bedroom, applying for jobs remotely while trying to explain to my well-meaning, that clueless family what exactly had happened. "Couldn't you have seen this coming?" my dad asked over breakfast one morning. Jake's company just announced bonuses even with the recession. Family gatherings became exercises in emotional restraint. Thanksgiving, Christmas, birthdays, each one featured Jake holding court, explaining how his company was recession-proof, while relatives asked me with pitying expressions if I had found anything street able yet. I wanted my family's validation. desperately. But I also refused to abandon the industry I loved. The tech world was challenging, yes, but it was where I felt most alive, most myself. Each dismissive comment from Jake, each concerned glance from my parents, each have you considered, accounting from well-meaning aunts and uncles chipped away at my confidence. But deep down, I knew returning to my true passion was just a matter of time. I just needed to weather this storm. And apparently, one more family holiday dinner. Easter at my grandparents' house is tradition set in stone. Their Victorian-style home with a wraparound porch has hosted for decades of family gatherings. The house itself is a testament to consistency. The same floral wallpaper in the dining room, the grandfather clock that chimes 15 minutes late, the collection of hand-painted eggs my grandmother adds to each year. By noon, cars lined the driveway and spilled onto the street. And Patricia and Uncle George arrived first with their teenage twins. Cousin Rachel came with her new husband. My parents showed up with ham from the butcher my grandfather insists is the only one who does it right. Everyone carried dishes covered in foil and plastic containers filled with sides. I arrived early to help Grandma Eleanor in the kitchen, partly out of genuine desire to assist, partly to avoid the inevitable questions about my job situation from relatives as they trickled in. "Hand me that mixing bowl, dear," Grandma said, as we prepared her famous deviled eggs. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and brown sugar from the sweet potatoes roasting in the oven. "How's the job search coming?" Unlike the others, when Grandma asked, I didn't feel judged. 3 promising leads, 2 remote positions, and 1 that would require relocating to Chicago. She nodded, piping filling into egg halves with surgical precision. You know, things weren't always straightforward for me either. I looked up, curious. "What do you mean?" A wistful expression crossed her face. Life takes unexpected turns. Sometimes the path that seems blocked leads to something better. Before she could elaborate, the doorbell rang again. The kitchen quickly became crowded with female relatives bearing dishes and updates. Aunt Patricia's promotion, Cousin Rachel's house hunting, my mother's garden club victory. I nodded and smiled appropriately while arranging carrots on a veggie platter, the conversation flowing around me like I was a rock in a stream. At 2 o'clock, just as Grandpa was asking if we should start without him, Jake arrived. He entered with his girlfriend Amber, a pharmaceutical sales rep he'd been dating for 6 months, making a grand entrance with a bottle of expensive champagne. Straight from my business trip to France, the family swarmed him like he was a returning hero. My father clapped him on the back. My mother kissed his cheek. Aunts and uncles peppered him with questions about his recent promotion to Senior Business Development Manager, the youngest in company history. He announced, as Amber gazed adoringly at him. "That's our boy." Dad beamed. I continued arranging the deviled eggs on the serving platter, fighting the urge to point out that I had become a team lead at 25. 3 years younger than Jake was when he got his promotion. But nobody had popped champagne for that. Grandma touched my arm gently. "Bring these rolls to the table, would you, dear?" Her eyes communicated understanding that didn't need words. The dining room table had been extended to its full glory, with all 3 leaves inserted. Grandmother's heirloom china gleamed against the white tablecloth. Name cards in my grandmother's perfect penmanship assigned seats. A diplomatic arrangement that separated feuding cousins and balanced conversationalists around the table. I found myself seated between Grandma and Cousin Rachel's husband Matt, whom I hardly knew. Jake and Amber sat directly across from me, prime position for maintaining eye contact during any conversation. As Grandpa carved the ham and dishes were passed around, Jake dominated the conversation with technical jargon about his company's new client management system. Of course, the implementation requires a complete paradigm shift in how we approach customer acquisition metrics, he explained, though I doubted anyone at the table understood or cared what that meant. Each time someone asked me a question about my job situation, Jake would interrupt with expert advice before I could fully answer. The tech industry is brutally competitive, he'd interject. You really need to differentiate yourself with specialized skills. Then he turned to explain to everyone else. Melissa's company was more of a small operation, nothing like the enterprise solutions we develop. I gripped my fork tighter with each interruption, trying to maintain my composure. Grandma occasionally squeezed my hand under the table when Jake was particularly condescending. The meal progressed through ham, potatoes, green bean casserole, and 3 different salads. I focused on my plate, contributing just enough to conversations to appear engaged while managing the herd and frustration building inside me. The familiar feeling of being simultaneously visible and invisible in my own family wrapped around me like an uncomfortable sweater. As dinner progressed, my Aunt Susan, always the most genuinely interested in my work, turned to me during a rare moment when Jake was occupied explaining something to Uncle George. Tell me about these job prospects, Melissa. What kind of positions are you looking at? I straightened up, grateful for the sincere question. Well, I'm focusing on front-end development roles with an accessibility specialization. My previous work developing tools for visually impaired users. Front-end is basically just making things look pretty. Jake cut in, somehow hearing from across the table. The real complex work happens on the back end. That's where the architecture decisions get made. I took a deep breath. Actually, modern front-end development involves complex JavaScript frameworks, state management, and in my case, implementing WCAG compliance standards. That WCAG? My father asked. Before I could explain the web content accessibility guidelines, Jake jumped in. It's just a checklist of things to make websites usable for disabled people. Pretty niche market. It's not niche, I corrected, feeling heat rise to my cheeks. 1 in 4 adults in the US has some type of disability. Making technology accessible and charity, it's expanding your market by 25%. Jake waved dismissively. Sure, but let's be real. The companies driving innovation are focused on broader applications. When I was in Silicon Valley last month meeting with potential clients, none of the major players were prioritizing accessibility features. That's because they're facing lawsuits for failing to implement them, I replied, earning a few surprised looks from around a table. Amber, Jake's girlfriend, tried to help but only made things worse. So you make websites for blind people? That's so sweet. Like a charity project. It's not charity, I repeated, struggling to keep my voice even. It's compliance with federal regulations and basic human decency to make technology usable for everyone. My mother, sensing tension, attempted to mediate. Melissa has always been so compassionate. Remember how she volunteered at the senior center teaching computer skills? Her comment, while well-intentioned, reinforced the narrative that my work was some kind of charitable hobby rather than a professional specialization. Jake took a long sip of his champagne. Look, there's nothing wrong with niche development work. It's important to find your level in the industry. Silicon Valley's competitive environment isn't for everyone. I'm not interested in Silicon Valley, I said. There's incredible innovation happening at smaller companies focused on solving real problems, instead of just chasing venture capital. Dad chuckled uncomfortably. Now, kids, let's not turn Easter dinner into a debate about computer stuff. It's not a debate, Dad, Jake said with a smirk. I'm just saying what everyone in the industry knows. He turned to address the whole table. The tech world has a natural hierarchy. Some people create groundbreaking innovations that change the world, and others, he glanced at me, find their comfortable little corners. The table had grown uncomfortably quiet. Amber looked embarrassed. Cousin Rachel was suddenly very interested in her sweet potatoes. Uncle George cleared his throat repeatedly. Then Jake delivered the line that would change everything. Not everyone can handle a real career. In tech, there's no shame in finding your level. The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. I felt my face burning with humiliation and anger. Tears threatened at the corners of my eyes. But I refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing me cry. 28 years of being diminished. dismissed, and underestimated by my own brother crystallized in that moment. The silence was broken only by the sound of Grandma Eleanor deliberately setting down her fork with a clink against fine china. I'd never seen the expression that crossed her face, something between indignation and determination. She carefully folded her napkin, placed it beside her plate, and adjusted her glasses. "Jacob," Grandma Eleanor said, using Jake's full name, always a warning sign in our family. "I've sat quietly for many years listening to your self-importance, but I think it's time for a family history lesson." The dining room fell completely silent. Even the twins stopped fidgeting with their phones under the table. "Eleanor," my grandfather said softly, with an expression I couldn't read. "It's time, Richard," she replied firmly. Before turning back to the table, before I was Eleanor Wilson, grandmother of 6 and baker of holiday hams, I was Eleanor Blackwell, employee number 10 to 873 at International Business Machines. Jake rolled his eyes slightly. "Grandma, I'm sure being a secretary at IBM was interesting, but we're talking about actual technical." "I wasn't a secretary," Grandma interrupted sharply. "In 1961, I was hired as a junior programmer in the early computing division at IBM's New York office." My mouth fell open in all our conversations about my tech interests. She had never once mentioned this. Women weren't exactly welcome in computing back then, she continued. "I had a mathematics degree from Vassar, but they tried to place me in the typing pool. It took the direct intervention of my professor, who had connections at IBM, to get me an interview for the technical team." She took a sip of water, her eyes distant with memory. "They wouldn't even print my full name on my badge or business cards. It was E. Blackwell, because clients might be uncomfortable knowing they were speaking to a woman about technical matters." My grandfather reached over and placed his hand over hers. A gesture of support I'd seen thousands of times, but now viewed in a completely new context. Between 1961 and 1967, I was part of the team that developed early compiler systems for business applications. Our work laid the groundwork for how companies would integrate computing into their operations for decades to come. She turned to Jake. "We didn't call it back-end development then, but that's essentially what it was. I specialized in creating efficient sorting algorithms when computer memory was measured in kilobytes, not gigabytes." Jake's confident expression had faltered. "You never told us about this." "No, I didn't," Grandma acknowledged. "Times were different then. When I married your grandfather in 1968, I was expected to leave my career. Women weren't supposed to continue working, especially in technical fields, after marriage. But that doesn't mean I stopped being who I was." She stood up with a grace that belied her 78 years. "Excuse me for a moment." The table remained silent as she left the room. My mother and aunts exchanged confused glances. My grandfather looked down at his plate, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Grandma returned carrying a dusty cardboard box I'd never seen before. She placed it on the sideboard and removed the lid. "This is what a real career in tech looked like for women of my generation," she said. Removing a black and white photograph, she passed it around the table. It showed a much younger Eleanor standing next to an enormous computer system, dressed in a neat skirt suit, her hand resting confidently on the machine. Next came a framed patent document. This was a sorting algorithm I developed that improved processing efficiency by 37%. The patent lists C. Blackwell among the inventors. Though my male colleagues received the public recognition, she continued pulling out artifacts, punch cards she had preserved, technical manuals with her notes in the margins, newspaper clippings about IBM's innovations with her team photographed in the background. My work was used in banking systems throughout the 1970s. When you use an ATM today, some of the fundamental logic still reflects principles we established. I stared at my grandmother in awe, seeing her completely differently. All those hours she'd spent encouraging my coding projects She'd understood far more than she'd ever let on. The final project I worked on before leaving IBM was developing compiler improvements for early COBOL implementations, she explained, showing us technical documentation that might as well have been written in ancient Greek to most of the family. But to me, despite the outdated terminology, the logic was familiar. So yes, Jacob, she said, returning to her seat, I understand quite well what constitutes a real career in tech, and from where I'm sitting. Your sister's work making technology accessible to people with disabilities seems far more innovative and worthwhile than managing client accounts, regardless of how many frequent flyer miles you accumulate visiting Silicon Valley. Jake's face had gone from shock to flush with embarrassment. No one at the table knew where to look. Why didn't you ever tell us? I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Grandma's expression softened. It wasn't something women of my generation talked about. We were expected to set aside our accomplishments when we became wives and mothers. By the time attitudes changed enough that I could have discussed it freely. It seemed like ancient history. She reached for my hand, but watching you grow up with the same passion for technology that I had, I should have told you sooner. Silence blanketed the dining room as everyone processed Grandma's revelation. The only sound was the grandfather clock's persistent ticking, still running 15 minutes behind actual time. Jake was the first to speak. His voice strained us. He attempted to regain control of the narrative. Well, that's quite interesting, Grandma. But modern tech is completely different from those early systems. The complexity and scale of what we do now, actually, Grandpa interrupted, surprising everyone. Your grandmother's work was remarkably complex given the constraints they operated under. Do you have any idea how difficult it was to write efficient code when every byte of memory was precious? Eyes turned to my typically quiet grandfather, who smiled at Grandma with unmistakable pride. Richard was one of the few who always believed women belonged in technical roles. Grandma explained, we met when he came to install new cooling systems for the computer department. Dad looked bewildered. Mom, why didn't you ever tell me about this part of your life? Would you have understood? Thomas, she asked gently, you were always more interested in business than technology. By the time you were growing up, I was focused on being a mother. Dad's expression shifted from confusion to something like regret. I realized he was seeing, perhaps for the first time, how his own attitudes about appropriate careers might have been shaped by unconscious assumptions about gender. Grandma stood again and retrieved more items from her box of memories. She spread out pages of code printouts, their edges yellow with age, across the dining table between the serving dishes. This was the project I was most proud of, she explained, pointing to lines of code that, despite being written over 50 years ago, I could partially understand. We had to develop a sorting system that could process financial transactions in real time with extremely limited computing power. As she explained the elegant solution her team had developed, I found myself asking technical questions. And soon we were deep in conversation about programming approaches, comparing modern methods to the constraints she had worked with. To my surprise, Amber, Jake's girlfriend, leaned forward with genuine interest. This reminds me of what my department went through when developing our pharmaceutical tracking system. We had to balance regulatory requirements with usability in a similar way. Jake stared at Amber, clearly not expecting her to engage with the technical discussion. As Grandma described the professional challenges women faced in early computing, and Patricia shared stories about her female colleagues in accounting facing similar dismissal of their expertise. Cousin Rachel mentioned the subtle sexism she encountered in law school. The conversation broadened beyond my specific conflict with Jake to examine patterns of how expertise gets recognized or doesn't based on who possesses it. Dad helped Grandma spread out more of her preserved materials on the clear dessert table. I had no idea, he kept saying, examining photos of his mother standing confidently among groups of men in white shirts and narrow ties, Jake sat increasingly isolated as the family conversation flowed around him. His earlier bravado had evaporated, replaced by an uncomfortable awareness of how his behavior appeared in this new context. After apple pie and coffee had been served, I found myself alone, with Jake on the front porch. We sat on the swing that had been there since our childhood, gently pushing back and forth with our feet. "Why did you never tell me about your team lead position?" he asked finally, breaking several minutes of tense silence. I studied the chip paint on the porch railing. "Would you have cared? Every accomplishment I've ever shared has been met with some version of 'that's nice.'" But he was quiet for so long I thought he might not respond. "I've always been scared," he admitted finally, his voice so low I almost didn't hear him. "Of what?" "Of not being enough." Jake stared at his hands. Dad expected me to follow his path. The business track was the only option presented to me. But I've always been terrified that I'm just mediocre at it. "Well, he hesitated. "You've always known exactly what you were passionate about. You taught yourself coding when we barely had internet. You built computers from parts other people threw away." I turned to look at him, seeing vulnerability in my brother's face for the first time in years. "I guess I convinced myself that your work couldn't be that important or valuable, because if it was, what did that say about my chases?" His laugh was hollow. "And now I find out our grandmother was basically a pioneer in computing. I've been a real jerk, haven't I?" It wasn't a full apology, but it was perhaps the most honest conversation we'd had in a decade. I sat with my competing emotions, vindication at having my expertise finally acknowledged, lingering hurt from years of dismissal, and surprising compassion for the insecurity Jake had been hiding beneath his arrogance. "The tech industry changes constantly," I said finally. "That's what makes it scary and exciting. Nobody knows everything. Even people with real careers in tech," he asked, attempting a smile. "Especially them," I replied, not quite ready to fully forgive, but taking a step in that direction. As we walked back inside, I faced a decision point. I could hold onto the righteous anger I'd cultivated for years, or I could begin the harder work of transforming our relationship into something healthier. The choice wasn't just about Jake, it was about what kind of person I wanted to be. 2 weeks after the Easter revelation, I found myself sitting in Grandma's sunroom, surrounded by materials she had kept preserved for decades. What had begun as curiosity about her career had evolved into something more significant. This memo references a team working on database indexing optimization, I said, pointing to a yellow document, "but it only mentions the lead engineer, Dr. Harrison." Grandma adjusted her reading glasses. "That was primarily my project. James Harrison was the department head, so everything went out under his name. But the core algorithm was mine." I'd spent hours recording Grandma's recollections, cross-referencing them with the documentation she kept, and researching early computing history. The more we uncovered, the more significant her contributions appeared. Using Grandma's address book, I located 3 of her former colleagues who were still alive. Walter Chen, now 83, responded immediately to my email. Eleanor Blackwell, of course I remember her. Brilliant mind. Her approach to compiler optimization saved us months of development time. Criminal that she had to leave when she got married. We all knew the work credited to the department during 65, 67 was largely built on her innovations. I organized Grandma's materials chronologically, creating a detailed timeline of her work. With her permission, I reached out to a tech historian at the Computer History Museum who specialized in women's contributions to computing. This is significant. Dr. Lakshmi Patel told me during our video call, examining scans of Grandma's documents, we have very few primary sources documenting women's technical contributions from this era. Most corporate archives maintain the official narrative that erased women's work. What startled me most was discovering that a sorting algorithm Grandma had developed for financial transactions was structurally similar to approaches still used in modern banking software. It's elegant, I explained to my parents over dinner. She figured out how to maximize efficiency with minimal memory decades before others were thinking about optimization this way. Dad, who had been uncharacteristically quiet since Easter, asked thoughtful questions about Grandma's work. I could see him struggling to reconcile the mother he thought he knew with this technical pioneer. I should have paid more attention when you were learning to code, he said suddenly. I just didn't understand it, so I assumed it wasn't important. 3 weeks into my research, I completed a presentation called The Forgotten Women of Computing, Eleanor Blackwell, and the Hidden Architects of Modern Technology. With Grandma's blessing, I contacted Naomi Rodriguez, a technology journalist known for covering diversity issues in tech. I'd love to interview both of you, Naomi responded immediately. The intergenerational aspect of this story is powerful. How your grandmother's hidden contributions connect to your current work in accessibility. The article, published in TechRant, was titled Grandmother-Granddaughter Tech Pioneers: How Women's Innovations Shape Computing Across Generations. It went viral within hours, shared by thousands of women in technology who saw their own experiences reflected in Grandma's story. My inbox filled with messages from tech companies interested in both my accessibility expertise and my research on computing history. A recruiter from Inclusive Design Partners, a prestigious firm specializing in accessible technology, requested a meeting. We're impressed by your technical background, but your ability to uncover and document overlooked contributions to computing history shows exactly the perspective we need on our team. What surprised me most was an email from Tech Legacy Foundation, an organization dedicated to preserving computing history. We're establishing a grant for researchers documenting the contributions of you, their presented groups to technology development. Would you consider becoming our first fellow, expanding your research beyond your grandmother's story? Rather than accepting either offer immediately, an idea began forming. Over Sunday dinner at my parents' house, now a weekly tradition since Easter, I shared my thoughts. What if I created a platform specifically focused on documenting and preserving the stories of overlooked contributors to technology? Not just women, but people of color, disabled developers, and others whose innovations haven't been properly credited. You'd need funding, Dad pointed out, but his tone was practical rather than dismissive. Actually, I said, 3 different investors have already expressed interest after reading Naomi's article. Jake, who had been invited at my request, spoke up. The market positioning would be unique. There's growing recognition of the need for diverse perspectives in tech development. It was the first time he'd ever discussed my work as a legitimate business opportunity rather than a hobby. 2 days later, I registered Tech Forgotten, LLC. Grandma agreed to serve as the company's first historical advisor. Our mission: to research, document, and promote the overlooked innovators who built the foundations of modern technology. By the time of our first investor meeting, I had assembled a preliminary advisory board including Dr. Patel from the Computer History Museum and 2 of Grandma's former colleagues. When Grandma walked into the conference room in her best suit, silver hair perfectly styled, the venture capitalists rose respectfully. Ms. Blackwell, the lead investor, said, "Your granddaughter tells me you wrote sorting algorithms. I'm still benefiting from every time I check my bank balance." Among other things, Grandma replied with a confidence I'd never fully appreciated before. As we presented our vision for preserving and celebrating overlooked contributions to technology, I caught Jake watching from the back of the room. He'd asked to attend, promising to just observe. After the investors left, expressing strong interest in funding our first year of operations, he approached awkwardly. "This is going to be big," he said simply. "Really big." Coming from Jake, it was high praise indeed. 6 months after that fateful Easter dinner, Tech Forgotten had grown from a concept to a thriving organization with 5 full-time employees and a network of volunteer researchers. Our first major project, Overlooked Architects, the Hidden Figures of Computing History, had documented the contributions of 23 previously uncredited innovators. Grandma Eleanor had emerged as something of a celebrity in tech circles. Tech Life magazine featured her in their Pioneers special issue, with a 2-page spread showing her then and now. 25-year-old Eleanor standing beside an early IBM system, and 78-year-old Eleanor demonstrating the same algorithms on a modern laptop. The family dynamics had shifted permanently. At gatherings, relatives now asked me detailed questions about my work, showing genuine interest. Dad had taken a programming course at the community college just to understand the basics, he explained. Mom had joined a book club reading about women in science and technology. The most significant change, however, was in Jake. His transformation wasn't instantaneous or complete. Old habits die hard, but it was genuine. He'd stopped dominating conversations and had developed an unexpected skill for asking thoughtful questions about others' work. I'm learning to listen more, he admitted during one of our now regular coffee meetings. My team at work has actually responded really well to it. My initial satisfaction at having my expertise publicly validated had gradually evolved into something more meaningful. The vindication I'd craved for so long turned out to be less fulfilling than the healing of our family relationships. Tech Forgotten's most popular initiative became our mentorship program, pairing teen girls interested in competing with women professionals. Grandma insisted on personally mentoring 3 students despite her age, meeting with them weekly via video calls to discuss both technical concepts and workplace navigation. Programming languages change, she told them, but the fundamentals of problem solving remain the same. I found unexpected purpose in this mission to document overlooked contributors. Each story we uncovered connected to contemporary issues in technology. Who gets credit? Whose needs get prioritized in design? Which problems are deemed worthy of solving? 6 months to the day after Easter, the family gathered again, this time to celebrate Grandma receiving a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Association for Computing Machinery, which had finally recognized her contributions to early compiler design. As we sat around the same dining table where everything had changed, Jake stood to offer a toast to Grandma Eleanor, he said, raising his glass, who not only helped build the foundations of modern computing, but also taught us that innovation can come from unexpected places. He turned to me and to my sister Melissa, who's ensuring that no brilliant mind gets overlooked again, regardless of who they are. The genuine acknowledgement from my brother meant more than any professional accolade. Later that evening, Grandma and I sat together on the porch swing. I spent decades being unseen, she said quietly, but watching you fight to be recognized in your field. That gave me the courage to finally claim my own work. I always felt like an imposter in tech, I admitted, like I didn't truly belong. Grandma took my hand. The question isn't whether we belong in these spaces, dear. The question is whether we're willing to create space for others at the table once we get there. That became the guiding principle for both my personal healing and professional mission. Success wasn't just about individual recognition, but about expanding the table. Jake and I still occasionally clash, siblings always will, but the competitive dynamic has transformed into something collaborative. He's become one of Tech Forgotten's most vocal advocates in corporate circles, opening doors I couldn't have accessed alone. The journey from that Easter confrontation to where I am now taught me that validation doesn't come from winning family arguments or even professional recognition. It comes from living authentically and using whatever platform you have to elevate others. As for imposter syndrome, it still visits occasionally. But now, when it whispers that I don't belong in tech, I think of Grandma Eleanor writing complex algorithms by hand in the 1960s while being erased from the narrative. I think of all the other hidden figures we've documented whose innovations shape our daily lives without recognition. And I remember that belonging isn't something others grant you, it's something you claim for yourself by doing the work you were meant to do, regardless of who notices. Have you ever discovered that someone in your family had a hidden talent or career that completely surprised you? Share your story in the comments below. If this video resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to hear more stories about family revelations and personal growth. Remember, sometimes the most important validation comes not from others, but from honoring your own path and creating space for others to do the same. Thank you for listening to my story, and may you find the courage to claim your own place at whatever table matters most to you.